Hi, this is Tony Politano. I'm a principal product manager with Amazon Web Services, responsible for our Resilience Hub product. Today, we're going to talk with you about preparing and protecting your applications from disruptions using AWS Resilience Hub. A little bit about our agenda today. We're going to talk about resilience services and how Resilience Hub kind of fits into that. And then we're going to go a little bit more into the Resilience Hub functionality and give you an idea about the workflow. That'll help us to guide a little better through a demonstration we're going to do. We're going to bring in an application, assess the resiliency, and go through some of the findings that you would normally see when you're using this product. There will be Q&A that will be at the end of this. So AWS Resilience Hub is a new service that was launched in November of 2021. And it's a service which is built to help our customers design, monitor, and work with resilient workloads in their organization. So it really is a product that has features in and of itself, which you're going to see. We do things like assessments and recommendations and RPO, RTO, recovery time objectives and recovery point objective monitoring. But we also are a hub that's part of this family of resilient applications or resilient services that we have at AWS, and they fit across these 5 different domains that we have, helping you to protect your applications, helping you to define what a resilient application is, making sure that you can test it, being able to monitor and manage these, and then being able to recover if something does happen. You see within here that we touch on a bunch of these different services. Today, we're going to really focus on Resilience Hub, but it's important to understand that for things like AWS Backup or AWS Elastic Disaster Recovery or AWS Fault Injection Simulator, we integrate with those and or make recommendations to these other services to help you to find the best places to go to understand what to do in our AWS services. Another point of clarification on this slide, you'll see sometimes that things are listed twice. Like for example, Elastic Disaster Recovery is both a protect and a recover service. It's because we're serving 2 different pieces in here, and AWS Resilience Hub understands what you should be doing to using Elastic Disaster Recovery to help protect, and then when to use it in a recovery mode to help you to get through these pieces that are here. It's real important that that we understand these next 2 concepts, because the rest of the flow of what we're going to do today really works based on these couple of pieces that we have here. First is that we're an application service. And what we mean by that is an application is a set of AWS services that you run a business application on. This could be something as big as running your SAP system, and you consider that an application, or it could be as small as a single microservice that you're running. That's an application that you run. It could contain one or many AWS resources in there, resources being things like compute for EC2 or ECS or Lambda, or database for RDS or Dynamo, and the various other services that make up an AWS infrastructure that applications run on. What we've done with AWS Resilience Hub is say we're leaving it up to you, the customer, on how to build an application, whether you say it's a big one or a small one, 1 resources, 50 resources that are in there. We didn't want to say this is what an application is, because it varies by business, it varies by business need, and it varies by resiliency targets on what you're going to do with that. But what we enable you to do is, once you define that application, is to really do 3 major things. You're going to see this as we go through the demonstration later. Define what that application is. So point us at that application. We have various ways that we can define an application to AWS. The second is to validate the resiliency of that based on certain resilience targets that you define. And then the last is to be able to track the resilience of that as it improves. For here, you see that we make some recommendations on an application level for what to do and for your ability to track that as you're going forward. So that's the first big concept. We need to make sure that we're talking about applications. You define the application. The second big concept is around our yardstick that we use. So we use recovery time objective and recovery point objective, which are industry standard ways of being able to manage the impact of a disruption to an application. Just so we're on the same sheet here, the recovery point objective is really measuring the amount of data loss that happens during an outage. This is typically measured in hours, seconds, minutes. So you say I've lost 5 minutes worth of data or 2 hours worth of data were lost because of this. The second is recovery time objective. This is when your application is back and can start accepting business transactions again. So it can when you can go and you could start either running queries or taking new transactions, or the system is considered back and running. A combination of these two are what help you to understand for that application what's your particular exposure that you have for a disruption that there would be, and how that can be communicated back to the business for the business risk that there is associated with an outage. So if you look at how we work backwards on trying to solve some problems that we have out here, if you think about the perceived simplicity, and I use the word perceived in there, of a data center failover in a non-cloud environment. You basically had a primary data center, a secondary data center. You had the ability to declare a disaster and to fail over. Hopefully you've practiced that a few times. I think we all know that on paper that looks great, but it's not as simple as it is. But we wanted to create that sense of simplicity in what we're doing by allowing the flexibility that you see on the right side, which is more along the lines of there's many different AWS services out there, and they have varying levels of redundancy, varying levels of resiliency, varying levels of durability that are out there. Without you having to figure out the different various permutations and combinations that there are for deploying those services on the side, allow you to say, look, I want something simple like on the left side, but I want my flexibility on the right side. AWS figure out what my resiliency is that's wrapped around here so that I can take appropriate actions. We have two kinds of capabilities that we do in AWS Resilience Hub, and I'm going to show you a bunch of these when we get to the demonstration portion of this. But on an application end, these four pieces are really what we go through when we're defining an application, analyzing an application within Resilience Hub. Like I talked about earlier, we define an application, and that application is the size of what you have, and it's using the infrastructure as code way that you choose of defining that. And then you define that recovery time objective, that recovery point objective, RTO and RPO. And we call it a resilience policy. So the policy means this is where I need to be in an acceptable level. If a disruption happens, that I'm not going to have impact on my business, or I'm going to have an acceptable level of impact to my business. Well, with those two things at hand, we then go and we assess the application. What we're doing is we're looking at how the application is configured by examining the metadata that's associated with each one of those resources. How is it configured? Where is the redundancy? What's the size? Various things that you do about this. But we're not actually going in and hitting the application, like running tests against the application. So it's a non-intrusive way of being able to assess and understand where your weaknesses are in here. So for example, a very simple classic solution of you have RDS MySQL, you're configured for a single AZ implementation of that, and you have a recovery time objective of 15 minutes. We will look at that and say, well, since you don't have a replica of that, you're running single AZ, you would need to recover from backup, and a full recovery from backup, you'd not be able to meet that recovery time objective. It would take you an hour or 2 hours or whatever it is, depending on the size of the database to recover it. So we're uncover, and then we'll make some recommendations on what to do for that. So using that same example, we could say, well, maybe have a replica in a secondary AZ, or maybe have a multi-AZ implementation, or maybe use Aurora Global so that you can be in multiple regions for that. We'll make a couple of recommendations and give you some costs that are associated with that, so you can make an informed decision that will match up to your resiliency. But we don't just stop at the configuration. One of the things we find with customers is that they need to have operational resiliency. So you need to make sure that things like your alarms are set up properly for being able to detect outages before they happen. Most customers are really great at setting up alarms for when something catastrophic happens, like the server goes down. But there's a wealth of alarms that are available out there for things like CPU or memory runs or partial disconnects that there are. So we're making recommendations so you get alarms, so you get a little leading indicator and get ahead and understand the health, and not just when something's catastrophic. We will also recommend FIS. We also recommend SOPs. So SOPs are standard operating procedures, which are SSM automation documents. You can think of these as chapters in a run book for when you need it to recover. So let's use the example that we have a dynamo table, and you want to recover. You want to recover that first. You need to make sure that dynamo is brought back. The second, maybe using point in time recovery. So bring it to a point in time recovery, and then make sure that you're matching the provision capacity that you have on there. Those are three things that can be highly automated, and we'll give you automation documents for doing things like that. The way we like to close on the application is you should test and verify. Fault Injection Simulator is AWS's chaos testing tool. And what we'll do is generate chaos tests for you that optionally you can go and execute to make sure that not only did we assess where you are, but you're able to inject faults into that system and see how it really reacts for this. The SOPs, alarms, the resilience testing, all these are things that are optional, but they're extremely important because they are things that we want you to be better at operationally ready. Now, shifting over to the right side, we want to take an enterprise view on where we are with this. We realize that customers are not going to bring in one application; they're going to bring in many applications, dozens, hundreds, even thousands of applications that we want to understand this. So allowing you to view your application portfolio and understand the posture across there, where are the strong points, where are the weak points. We use a concept called resilience score. For this, a resilience score is basically rating how well you've done on meeting your policy and how much of are you operational ready, so that you can easily understand across dozens or hundreds or thousands of applications where you are and where your progress is against there. The second bullet down on the right side, which is around CI/CD integrations, this is one of the I guess coolest things that you can do here. It's about building into your pipelines the ability for being able to go and run assessments and see before you do a deployment, have you degraded your resilience posture at all in there? Have you made your resiliency worse? So let's say you went through the left side, you got your application upward as a 15-minute RTO that's out there, but somebody makes a mistake in a configuration and it's going to make it worse in 15 minutes. Well, you want to catch that. It's a drift detection capability that we have for doing this. And the last portion is that we have audit trails for compliance on this. You want to know, when did we go sideways on our resiliency, or somebody wants to go back and look. Well, back on April 12th, what was our resilience? Because we want to understand our position that we need for compliance reports or regulatory or other reasons that we have out here. So we have this application and this enterprise view that work in conjunction with each other in Resilience Hub. If you look at what we're really trying to do here, it's all the way over on the right side. We're trying to reduce application related outages. We want to take that RTO and RPO and shrink it down to an acceptable level, or even a smaller level than you want, if it's not going to cost more for doing that. And if you work from the right to the left on this, first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we're out in front of those problems before they hit production. So we identify and resolve resilience related problems before they hit us. And that's going to enable us to consistently meet resilience targets that are out there. We want to make sure that this is not that one-time event, and that you can consistently meet that by continuously validating and tracking your resiliency on here. So we don't want this to be, okay, I ran my resilience in January, it looks good, and something happens in July. Well, what happened? How did we go sideways? I can't understand how this happened. We want you to continuously stay in front of this and identify where they are, and not allow things to get out to production that could possibly put you at risk for this. So I'm going to briefly bring you through a little build here of what it's like to work with Resilience Hub, and then we're going to jump over and we're going to run through a bunch of things that I'm about to show you. So the first step is to get your application into into Resilience Hub. Now, that doesn't mean that you're taking a copy of the application or do something like that. What you do is you point it as the infrastructure code that you already have in place out there. It could be CloudFormation stacks. It could be Terraform. We can also go directly against Service Catalog App Registry. So if you registered an application in there, or if you use resource groups for like tag-based or stack-based resource groups. So you point Resilience Hub at these existing applications that are out there. By the way, we support multi-region and cross-region accounts, applications in here. So if you have a multi-region application or you have something that's drawing on a secondary account, you can do that. I will caution, just like any other AWS service, if you're going to go cross account, make sure you have the right permissions in place. Resilience Hub doesn't have some secret passkey that it can go against any AWS account because you say it's part of your resilient application. Like I said earlier, we're defining the RTO and RPO targets for this. I'm going to talk when we get into the demonstration portion about the difference between application infrastructure availability zone and region, but it's a way of you homing in on where is the real problem that's in there. Am I exposed on a hardware, software, or data center layer that we are? We've built in some templates to help you out, but you can define your resilience policy down to a second level. You could say my RTO is, 10 minutes and 14 seconds. It's up to you on the level of granularity that you want to get into. We want you to run the assessment. And you see that there's ability for setting up the assessment to rerun on a scheduled basis, even if you're not using CI/CD for this. So we're going to give you back those configuration adjustments, those CloudWatch alarms, those fault injection simulator tests, and the SOPs for recovery. So based on your configuration, you're going to get different types of recommendations back that will help you with doing this. This is about what we're going to go through when we go over the demo, but what really happens as you start to use this more is we want you to implement some of these fixes. So if you identify a problem, fix it, and then test it. We love for you to come back and test it using Fault Injection Simulator. But we also want you to think about building this into your pipeline so that you start to build that continuous view of what you're doing. If you don't want to build this in the pipeline, using our automated capability for assessing this on a daily basis is a great way to also get ahead and understand things before they go sideways. And like I closed out before, we really want to track the resilience posture across time. So we have the ability for looking at, has your resiliency gone up and down, and any assessment that's done is retained within our application. So I'm going to jump over to Resilience Hub now. Just to close out, Resilience Hub, we're going to talk about some of the built-in functionality with the Resilience Hub, which is around this resiliency. But Resilience Hub will make recommendations and will interrogate these other services out here so that a customer can understand and be confident that they're going against the right resiliency services that there are within AWS to help them out. There are some resources that you can get with this. So we have information on our console. We have a lot our technical documentation, including a fair amount of blogs that are out there now about things like CI/CD integration. It's pretty self-service on where we do. You see when we get over to the demo, there's not a lot of screens to it, but there's a lot happening behind the scenes. All right, so let's get started with the demonstration here on Resilience Hub. Resilience Hub is a service that, like I said, it's been available since November of 2021. We're available in 21 regions right now. It's something just to get off the bat on this, a bit about pricing about it, about Resilience Hub. We do have a free trial associated with this so that customers can try this out without any cost to them. In fact, we want you to try this for a while with a 6-month free trial, up to 3 applications to get a feel for what there is out there. Beyond the free trial, this is a service which is only priced at $15 per application per month. And again, going back to what we talked about with applications, that there are Your application can be as small as a microservice, as big as SAP. It doesn't matter about the size of the application. It also doesn't matter how many assessments you run, whether you run the assessment once in a month or you run the assessment, 10 times in a day. We're not looking at that. What we didn't want the service to be is where somebody comes and says, well, I couldn't assess my resiliency because it was going to cost me too much to get in front of it. We want this to be very approachable. We want this to be something which is easy to use and is not going to be a major impact for customers if they're going to want to use this. So the first thing, like I talked about in that workflow, we want to go through, we want to add an application. You see that you can add an application using multiple ways that I described earlier. We can use cloud formation stacks, we can use resource groups, we can use app registry, or we can use Terraform state files, which are out here. Also, if you have an application already out there and you want to open it up and make some changes to it, this is a way that you can do this. I have a pre-built application out here, which has a combination of things in cloud formation stacks. So I'm going to grab a few of these stacks out here. I know where they are in this. I'm going to grab some stuff about my applications. I'm going to grab some stuff about the supporting services and some of the backup stacks that I have here. So it's 5 stacks that are in here. And then I'll just name this, and then down here, you see the scheduled assessments. So I have the option here when we default to, we want you to run this every day. There's no cost to run this. There's no impact to your resources for doing this. So we love for you to run this and stay active on this. I can bring this to non-active here. And just run it one time if you don't want to do that. I then move forward with letting Resilience Hub go and walk those stacks. So what Resilience Hub is going to do right now, you see it's spinning away. It'll spin here for a short amount of time. It's going to look at those 5 different stacks, and it's going to identify all the AWS resources that are in there, and then present them back to us and saying, "Here's what I saw in your stack. Here's what I'm going to analyze." And by the way, it's going to look at things in your stack that you may not that we may not be able to analyze at this time. For example, while we're doing this recording here, EKS is something that we're releasing at a future time. So you see EKS is something which is listed as not supported. It doesn't mean it's going to stop us from analyzing that stack. It just means it's part of that stack. Give you an idea about what we're looking at, so that gives you a little bit of context as we go through. I've got some, as you can see from the resource types down the side here. I've got some Lambdas, I've got some S3, I've got some EC2, I've got some RDS, got some SQS, and then, like I said, I've got some other things down here that I'm not really going to bring in and make it part of the analysis. The next thing that we do is we assign a resilience policy to this. You can see I already have some named policies out here. Let me show you how you create a policy, though, because I think this is will give us some insight into the 4 layers that we do with looking at policies. So if you don't know your RTO and RPO, we can help you out with some suggested policies that there are here. These are just kind of like, think of them as starter kits on where you are. So for example, a global mission critical application. These are the RPOs and RTOs that you have. You don't need to take these. You can define these as you are, but this is a good point to explain the difference between the RTOs, RPO layers that we have in here. We fully realize that a commitment is made from IT back to business that this is the RTO, RPO for the application. And that's a commitment that you make to the business. But what we want to do is help you out with understanding where are some of those weaknesses in there, maybe allow you to adjust this. You can see that some of these have different RTO, RPOs based on the layers. Region is pretty self-explanatory. If there's a regional disruption, availability zone, similar. If there's availability zone disruption. Infrastructure you can think of as a hardware. The instance or the cluster becomes unavailable. Application is really a software issue. So this, we kind of cross over to the customer's end of the shared responsibility model on this, in that everything's running from an AWS perspective, but your application may not be reacting the way it should. Classic example of this is that you've clobbered a database or clobbered a table in the database and you need to restore from that. Well, as far as we know, the application is still, the database supporting that application is still running, but you will need to go and recover for that. So the idea we have with Resilience Hub is not just think about what we do from our end, but help customers to help themselves for doing this. You could select one of these and create an application, a resilience policy out of here. I'm going to cancel out of this and just choose one of the ones that I already had in place. for this here. And what I'm going to do is grab a single region um, for this, and then I'm going to go through my quick screen here, quick scroll. It's basically just nothing but a confirmation screen. I'm going to publish, and I'm going to assess this application. So publish makes it available now within Resilience Hub, and I can take all the different actions that are here. And the first action I'll be guided to is to uh, run an assessment. You take the default name, but I normally like to just put this up here so that I can keep track of what I'm doing. And I'll run this, and it'll go off and start running. You see it's in progress. I could refresh on this. The two fields that we really care about in here are, is the thing running, which we see that it is, and it'll come back and tell us compliance status. Compliance status means for that particular RTO and RPO that we defined, did the stack that we described to this provide the ability for meeting that? And if it did not, the assessment report will come back and tell us precisely where that problem is, which type of resource. Is it a database problem? Is it a network problem? And is it at the availability zone layer? Is it at the infrastructure layer? Is it at the application layer? So you see, we came back here and I see that my policy is breached. I can dive right into that assessment now. So within this assessment, I find the best view to look at this is this grid view that we have here. There's a lot of ways to look at it, but this grid view, I can look at all my resources that are out here, and I quickly see where are my problems in here. You can see that I've got a lot of things which I'm doing quite well on RTO and RPO on here. If you remember, I had a 1 hour, this is a 1 hour and 15 minute, 1 hour RTO and a 15-minute RPO. And you can see that I'm meeting or exceeding that on many of these, but I've got a couple weak points in here. So my first weak point here is around database. So I click on here, it tells me the Dynamo table, physical idea, where I want to go for that. And what's wrong with that? Well, quick explanation here, and there's a more detailed resiliency recommendation that you get out of this. Also, it gives you, bullet points a bit more on this, but I've got a table out there and I don't have any point in time recovery. This makes perfect sense in that if I step on that table by mistake, I don't have a way of recovering back from that. So maybe the first thing that I want to do with this is attack this problem right now. I've already opened up another tab here which has that table in here. So within that table, I'm going to go and I'm going to enable that backup for that. So I'm going to go into the table and enable point in time recovery. I'm going to save those changes and then I'm going to go back over here to Resilience Hub. Before I reassess it, I'm going to look at my other problem because I've got two problems in here, or two troublesome pieces. I've got a storage component. So my storage component says that I've got an S3 bucket. So this output bucket here, I will go and look at what is it telling me is wrong. And it says that I don't use Glacier and I don't have versioning. So similar to the problem with the Dynamo table, if I step on this particular bucket, delete something or change it when I shouldn't have done that, being that I haven't enabled this, I can't recover. That's why we say unrecoverable. There's no way that AWS can help you unless you help yourself by changing this. So similar to this, I've already got another tab open here and I don't have bucket versioning turned on. I'm going to now turn on bucket versioning. I'm going to enable that and I'm going to save the changes. So I identified two major problems that there are in here. Maybe I want to go and assess and see, did I get any better with this? So I can go back and I can reassess this. So if I go up to the assessment reports and I can run the reassessment here, I'll just call this 1 second. and it's gonna do the same thing. You see how I talked about earlier, how we keep track of all the tests that all the assessments that were in here. You'll be able to go back and see all these assessments that are here, and you start to see when did a breach happen. If you're running daily assessments, by the way, you're going to see all the daily assessments that have happened throughout here. And we also have some graphing capabilities and other things where you can start to see the resilience score over time and see things going up or down that there are associated with this. So one of the things that is fairly common for our customers to do is to do just what I'm doing here of chipping away at pieces and see how it impacts the resiliency and see how it gets better or gets in some cases gets worse. What some customers actually do is go in and with a good policy, they meet this and then try to break it and see how far can I push it. So the second one came back. You see, I'm still breached, and I'll explain why I'm still breached on here. But I want to show you the fixes that we made. If you remember, we had problems in this first grid here. I have no problems now, for those database components that I had here for that table that I had. You can see that I can now meet my RPO, RTO this for 20 minutes and 5 minutes. So I'm able to now recover this. And for my storage component down here, I'm able to bring this back also. So I've really fixed an oversight that I had in that I didn't have backups in place, and AWS still would have been up and running. I wouldn't have got any alarms about this actually. It would have just kept running. And I only would have found out when I went to recover for this because I stepped on the data. But let me close up this grid and show you another grid out here. So if you remember, we talked about application infrastructure and availability zone. So my availability zone down here, you see I've got a problem in this one with a networking appliance. Oh, what's going on here? I've got a NAT gateway out here, and it says that I'm unrecoverable in that because I don't have an alternate gateway configured for doing this. So the obvious thing would be to set up a secondary NAT gateway for this and move forward with that. I'm not going to go through fixing all of these in here, but that's kind of the flow that you would go through for setting up the fix. Okay, so after we've assessed for a single region, maybe we want to understand how would this run in a multi-region way of doing this. That's as simple as us going up and picking a different policy that we have here. So remember, I had all these different policies that were already defined. I use a single region. I'm not going to pick a two-region one that I already had set up. All I'm really doing is changing the yardstick here. I'm not changing anything to do with the application. The application is still the way that it was. I'm going to rename this to MR here, just so that I know that it's the multi-region one. And I'm telling Resilience Hub, add another layer to look at this. I've already looked at availability zone. I've already looked at infrastructure. I've already looked at application or software issues that we have. Now go back and say, if for some reason I wanted to deploy this in a multi-region environment, what would my resiliency be in the case of a regional disruption? So it's running similar type of tests, but the tests that it's running are taking into account that the region has had a problem and I'm either failing over or having to be redundant in that secondary region. So you see I came back, I breached that one. If I go and I open this up, similar screen that we saw before, but you're going to see when I go down to region here, I've got a lot of problems wrong. If my application, by the way, is still fixed here. So those things I did around my buckets and so forth, they're okay. But when I come down in here and I open up this grid, you're going to see that I've got a lot of things in here that are unrecoverable. And this is interesting because I've only defined a single region application to this. So of course, many of these things are not going to be here and not be available for me. So for example, that database that we did a good job of fixing up there, that Dynamo table that I have, it's not a global table. So if I want to take that point in time recovery that we have in the single region and now make it global for this, that would be a great way for me to be able to make this recoverable in the secondary region. Another way to do it is to have a backup in the secondary region. So Resilience Hub would have saw that you had a backup in a second region for doing this. So there's a couple different ways that you can think about making yourselves better for this in moving forward. In fact, if you want to go and look at those recommendations in a little bit more detail instead of just that one liner that there is out there, if I go to resiliency recommendations here, I'm going to get a whole list of recommendations down the left side here. I'll scroll quickly through these and just go down to that database one and show you uh, what some of the recommendations are that are wrapped there. And see, I have all these things around my EC2 instances, my DB2, my DB clusters. But for this one here, let's take a look at what Resilience Hub is telling me to do. So what Resilience Hub is telling me to do is get myself up on global tables. Make sure that I've got a readiness check set up in application recovery controller for this. And I could also add my replica to here, and here's what my new RPO and RTO will be. By the way, you see three options up here. One is optimized for RTO, RPO. Another is there a cheaper way to do it? Another way is there a way to do it with minimal changes? In the case of this one, it's actually the one change is the cheapest way to do it. It has a minimal amount of changes, and it also gets you the best amount of RTO and RPO there. If there were things where there were different ways of doing this, remember I talked earlier about RDS, where you can have read replicas, or you can multi-AZ, or you can go Aurora. That's a that's a chance where you may see three different ones that there aren't here. So what we've done so far is we've really gone in and we've looked at an application. We've assessed that application and made some fixes to it to make it more compliant in single region. And we found problems if we were going to multi-region, which are much bigger that we want to attack for doing that. The last thing that I want to go over here is operational. If you remember, I talked earlier about operational recommendations that we make for making you more resilient from an operational perspective. So we've looked at this stack and we've come back and we said there's three levels of improvements that we'd like you to consider making. The first is alarms. So these are alarms based on your stack that you've provided to us. This stack, if you remember, it has all this Lambda and EC2 and RDS and SQS and all these pieces out here. What alarms should you be looking at putting on for this so that you can be at the highest level of monitoring for resiliency? So for example, if I look here for EC2, so here's some EC2 alarms that we're looking at doing. So the typical one that people do is an instance failing. But then there's other things out here. If just a process has stopped. So if there's a dead process, we have a dead process alarm. A lot of people don't take advantage of this, or CPU runs, or when we got memory runs that are low, or storage problems that we have. These are things where, again, as far as we know, the server is still going to be up and running, but you may want to put these out here and make sure that you're alarming for these here. If I look at standard operating procedures are, think of them as chapters in a run book, what you should be doing to make sure that you are prepared for recovering from a problem. So let me take Dynamo as an example for one in here. And what we're saying is that if you're going to have to recover that Dynamo table that's out there, because remember, we have not enabled global tables yet. So it's saying you really need to bring this thing from a backup. And then the next thing you should do is have this as a point in time recovery, because remember, we did enable point in time recovery already. And by the way, make sure that your provision capacity is there for this. These are our CloudFormation templates that we can generate here. So if we wanted to, we generate these. These would be SSM automation documents that you could though go and run in the event of a failover and that you needed to do this recovery here. Now I want to get across this. It's not a complete run book of run books. What we're doing is giving you based on what you've described to us, but we consider best practices and automation around those best practices for doing recovery of either your databases or your compute or your network that's associated with that. The last kind of recommendations that we make are around fault injection templates. So these are experiments that we do. This is injecting, if you remember, it's fault injection, injecting faults into your system, or chaos testing. And what, if you look at this for what we talk about with EC2, for this, we're looking at there's some EC2 running, compatible EC2s running within our ECS. So we're giving you some ECS failures that are in here. This stack contains some ECS. We're also going to do some EC2 tests. So let's have a process die suddenly. Let's put some load on this. Let's put some CPU load, and let's put some memory load. This is what's interesting about how all the operational recommendations tie back together. You see this little configuration warning that we have out here. What this is telling us is that we've recommended an alarm to you. If you remember from the first screen, we had some alarms that we were doing out there. This test is going to trigger this alarm, and you want to make sure that you have this alarm up, because it's going to give you evidence that this test was really working here. Now, same thing with this that we had with the alarms and with the SOPs. We could create CloudFormation templates, go out, implement them, and then we could execute them directly within Resilience Hub to inject fault in here. The thing I would say that we want to think about is, because Fault Injection Simulator injects faults, it tries to break the system. Understand what environment you're putting this against, a non-prod type of environment that you're looking at sending this against, because you don't want to inadvertently introduce faults into something, into the wrong environment that you have for this. So if I were to generate these templates here, it would create these templates for me. And based on these templates, I would see them here. And I'll just click through to show you that we generate some things in here. So this would go into an S3 bucket. And in an S3 bucket, we would have basically a payload in here, which has a directory structure, which has some JSON files inside of that you can then take and so there's a manifest about what's within this JSON. And then the other thing that's within here is the actual JSON itself. So if I take this and I click on here, I can then download this. So it will download for you, and you can put these directly into CloudFormation. You download them, include them in your existing stacks, but you see that we generate fully functional code that we want you to use as a template. There's things that are in here. We're not saying just take this and execute it blindly, but understand what you're doing in here. But you see that we have, for example, ECS, forcing a task failure in here, telling what it's due, what is the automation action that we're doing this, what are some parameters that we want to pass for this. So it's a great way to kind of get you kick-started with Fault Injection Simulator based on some of the tests that we have. And you see similar type of structures when we're over in the alarms and when we're over in the SOPs. Again, these are templates. We want you to take these as kind of almost code snippets and then include them in what you're doing, but it gives you a great head start on where you're going and homes you in on where we think you should be testing, where we think you should be alarming, where we think you should be doing the SOPs and SSM documents for. So let me jump back over to Resilience Hub. So I'm back over to the resiliency assessment here. We've already gone and we've looked at some of our recommendations. Again, if we had run through and run the CloudFormation for those FIS experiments and set them up, you'd be able to come in here and run these directly within here, so that you could see the results of the test. You could still go out to FIS if you want Fault Injection Simulator, but we're just trying to make it a little easier for what we did. So to kind of recap on what we did today, we ran the full life cycle on an application. As far as we described an application which was 5 Terraform stacks, 5 CloudFormation stacks, which had a whole bunch of resources in there, about 30 resources: ECS, EC2, RDS, Dynamo, so forth. Ran an assessment against that using a policy which really looked at just a single region. for doing this. We found a couple of quick problems that we could fix that were really on the customer side of the shared responsibility. One was that we had a dynamo table, and the other we had an S3 bucket, both of which we didn't have any protection on. So if we made a mistake and stepped on those or deleted those or wrote the wrong values to those and wanted to recover from them, there was no way to recover. We went and we fixed those by turning on some very simple functions, by having point in time recovery and having versioning on there, reassessed and saw that we were in a much better position. We then kind of moved the goal line a bit on that. We then said, let's look at this as a multi-region and see where we're exposing. You see that there are many things that were exposed in there, which is obvious because we only looked at a single region application here, but it gives you a good head start on where should I look at and where should I be going. The last thing we did was we looked at operational readiness on here and understood that from a resiliency perspective, there are alarms, standard operating procedures or SSM automation documents, components of a run book, and fault injection simulator or chaos testing, which is required for you to make sure and that what you think is out there, you're testing. Now, the whole idea behind all of this is we've gone through this once. If you remember from the beginning, we talked about how we want to be continuous. Use all of this without even going to the console. We could go directly against the APIs and call these assessments every time there's a deployment, and then take appropriate actions out of there. One of those actions may be kick off those fault injection simulator tests. Okay, I'm good on assessment. Kick off the test and make sure that everything's good before I deploy. If you fail on it, one of the things could be halt the deployment. Don't let it go forward. Or it could be go forward and notify within a certain threshold that there is within there. In fact, the concept that we have of resilience score, which I really didn't go over a lot today, takes into account your compliance to that policy. It takes into account your SOPs, alarms, and fault injection simulator, and assigns a resilience score to you. This is what a resilience score is all about. We're basically looking at, do you meet your policy that's out here? Do you have test SOP and alarm coverage? And we're assigned out to this so that you could track as you're improving on various portions of this. This gets back to that portfolio view that I was talking about, understanding where the strong and weak points are from a resilience policy, from an alarm, from an SOP, and from a testing, and where you can home in to make things better, look for improvements, and more importantly, be alarmed of any type of degradations that are in there. So I want to thank you for spending time with us today here. Hopefully you've had some had some learnings from both how we see resiliency from an AWS perspective and how we've brought this to bear in a service which is very approachable and is applicable to just about any workload that you have out there in AWS. Thank you.